Before there was moonlight, there was only longing. Our Sun Empress descended into the afterlife, and the lonely Emperor built the moon so she could finally rest beside the people she loved. This is the story for Mayong entitled The Moon Was Born from Longing. If this tale stirred something in you, a memory, a dream, or a truth, our Ko-fi, Amazon, and Patreon links are in the description. Support helps us keep writing for you and the ones you hold dear. The Sun Empress Yong had ruled so long beneath the gaze of all things that even silence learned to praise her. Every dawn, the palace doors opened before she touched them, not from courtesy but from fear, and from the gold of her presence seeped through carved cedar and pearl-studded walls, until the hinges smoked and the servants bowed with trembling hands, ready to greet her with hymns bright enough to wake the mountains. Priests scattered petals before her steps, though the petals browned before they reached the floor. Courtiers smiled through pain and called it devotion, and the rivers lifted steam when she passed over them. Snowfields became mirrors. Children born under summer moons were told that Yong's light was mercy, that Yong's light was life, that Yong's light was the reason wheat rose and mother sang, and old men warmed their hands before dying. No one asked if light could grow tired of being needed, and each morning she wore the crown of the living fire. Each evening she removed it alone. That was the part no hymn remembered. In her private chamber, where curtains of woven sunrise hung from the columns of white jade, Yong stood before a basin of cool drained water and watched her reflection tremble beneath the heat still pouring from her skin. The servants had changed the flowers again. They always did. Fresh lilies at dawn and the ash by dusk. The marble beneath her feet held faint in golden scars where she had stood too long, while receiving petitions. A farmer begging for rain and a king begging for victory. A mother begging that fever leave her son. Yong had answered them all, and she always had answered. Her hand rose to clasp beneath her throat. The crown came away with a whisper like a small dying flame, and for one breath the room dimmed. Yong closed her eyes. In that dimness, she almost heard herself. Not the hymns, not the prayers, not the endless chorus of need rising from the world like a smoke from a thousand cooking fires. Herself is a softer thing, a woman buried inside an empress, a girl who once loved the hush before morning, a lonely heart that had forgotten the shape of being held without becoming someone's miracle. She laughed once quietly, and the sound hurt. Your radiance, a voice came from beyond the screen. Young straightened before she meant to even be alone. Her spine remembered the command. What is it? The astronomers have collapsed again, said the attendant, trying to keep panic from her voice. They say that the days are lengthening too much, and the western orchids have begun flowering out of season. Young looked down at the crown in her hands. It pulsed faintly, hungry to return to her brow. I will correct it, she said. There was a relief outside the screen, immediate, grateful, and devouring. When the attendant left, Yong remained still for a long while. Far below, somewhere in the mortal cities, someone was singing an old harvest song. She could hear it through the golden veins of the world, faint as breath against glass. The sun keeps watch and the children sleep. The fields remember what we keep. Yong listened until the melody faded. Then she placed the crown back on her head. The next day, she made orchards obey her season, and their seasons too. She shortened the hours by a careful measure, and she warmed the sick boy's room without burning the curtains. She ripened wheat in a valley where soldiers had trampled spring into mud. She did everything beautifully, perfectly, and eternally. And still, by the twilight, when the sky bruised violet in the edges and the first stars trembled awake like shy witnesses, Young stood up at the balcony of the Star Palace and felt a terrible envy of shadows. They were allowed to rest wherever light did not demand them. But beyond the rim of the world lay the lands no sunbeams governed, the afterlife. Mortals spoke of it with lowered voices as though death were a door that disliked being named. They imagined cold halls and faceless judges, rivers of forgetting, kings made of bone, but Young had heard older stories, one sung by widows who survived long enough to dream honestly. There was an emperor there, they said. Jess, the emperor of the afterlife. Not cruel and not kind in a foolish way of spring, gentle in the way deep earth was gentle, holding seeds and graves with the same patient hands. Soldiers who died afraid said that they woke to someone sitting beside them until their fear passed. Mothers who left children behind said a quiet king let them weep without calling their grief weakness. Old poets claimed that in his kingdom lanterns burned not to expose sorrow but to help it find a chair. Young had never met him. Perhaps that is why she thought of him. He ruled the place where all things ended and no one demanded that he shine. The thought came to her slowly, then all at once. I want to sit beside someone who does not need me to become they. It was selfish and it was impossible. It was the truest prayer she had ever made. That night when the world finally turned its face from her and the horizon swallowed the last blade of cold and gold, Young dismissed her court earlier than the custom allowed. The ministers protested with the careful mouths. Priests asked if omens troubled her. Musicians bowed mid-song and their final note not hung unfinished in the air. Rest, she told them, and the word felt strange leaving her lips, almost foreign and almost forbidden. Then the Sun Empress descended alone. She passed through corridors where the walls were cooled behind her. She crossed gardens of glass flowers that chimed softly as her light withdrew. She moved beyond the last gate of her palace, where no servant followed and no hymn dared survive, and at the edge of the twilight a stairway appeared, made not of stone but ash, shadow, and the memory of extinguishing candles. Young paused, and for the first time in centuries no one called her name. The silence did not bow, it simply waited, and she stepped down. With each stare, her radiance softened. Gold became amber, and amber became dusk. Around her, the air changed. It becomes something that smelled of rain and old wood, and of incense after funerals, of soil turned by hands that knew hunger. The darkness was not empty. It glowed faintly, blue, threaded with lanterns, drifting over rivers that reflected stars not yet born. Souls moved in the distance, some laughing and some weeping, some walking quietly beside guides whose faces were hidden by the hoods of moth and winged grey. Bells sounded beneath the earth. Somewhere someone hummed a lullaby. Young knew but couldn't name. She nearly turned back, not from the fear of death, but from the fear that if she entered a place where no one needed her, she might discover she did not know how to exist. At the bottom of the stair waited a hall of black stone and silver lamps, and at the center of it, seated beside a low fire, was Jess. He did not rise in worship. He did not shield his eyes. He only looked at her as if she were not the sun, not the axis of harvest and prayers, not as the golden answer to desperate worlds. As if she were tired. A chair waited from him. Beside it, tea steamed in a small clay cup. "You came far," Jess said. His voice was quiet enough that Young had to listen with her whole heart. She stood there, unable to remember the correct way to be divine. I think, she said, and her voice nearly broke from the unfamiliar mercy of being heard. I came because I am tired. Jess moved the cup a little closer to her. Then sit, he said. No one has to shine here. For a long time, Yong did not sit. She stood before the low fire of the afterlife as though the chair were a throne offered by an empty kingdom, as though comfort itself was a trap dressed in kindness. The habit of centuries held her upright, and the sun did not slump. A sovereign did not tremble. An empress did not cross into the realm of endings because her heart had grown too heavy for mourning. Yet Jess did not urge her. That was the first impossible mercy. He only waited, one hand resting near the teapot, his face lit by flame and lantern glow, his dark hair touched with the silver form of the lamps above. The hall around him seemed carved from night after sorrow had learned patience. Souls passed beyond the archways in quiet streams, some pausing to look at Yong, but none fell to their knees. None raised hymns, none begged her to burn brighter. They looked at her with wonder, yes, but wonder softened by the rules of that place, where even awe was asked to remove its shoes before entering. At last, Yong lowered herself into the chair. The sound of her breath leaving her body was almost a confession. Just then poured the tea. It was a small thing, absurdly small, but Yong watched as if he had moved a star. No servant rushed to do it for him. No herald announced the gesture. No court painter immortalized the angle of his wrist. He simply poured tea into a clay cup, steam curling upward in pale ribbons, carrying the scent of roasted barley, rain-wet soil, and something faintly sweet, like pears kept in a wooden box. I do not know how long I can stay, Yong said. Then stay for the length of one cup. I may be missed. You're always missed, Jess replied. The words struck too gently to defend against. Yong looked down, her reflection trembled in the dark tea, not radiant, not crowned, only blurred by steam. That is the problem, she said to Jess. Jess did not answer quickly. She began to understand that his silences were not empty halls but rooms with lamps inside them. Being needed is not the same as being loved, he said. Yong's fingers tightened around the cup. Far away through the corridors of the afterlife, someone sang their breath, and the melody wandered in fragments, worn smooth by many mouths. This lullaby, perhaps, or a funeral song that had forgotten to be sad. Sleep now, little ember. Night has learned your name. Yong closed her eyes before she meant to. The tea warmed her palms without demanding anything from them. In the days that followed, though days were difficult to name beneath the earth of endings, she returned whenever twilight loosened. The gold chains from her shoulders the first time arrived formally, dressed in robes that glowed along the hems, her crown still blazing, and her voice polished into courtly grace. Just received her without ceremony. Each time he would be pruning lantern vines in a garden where blue flowers opened only for the dead, or mending a cracked bowl with patient fingers, or listening to an old woman to tell him the same story 3 times because memory had arrived before she had. Yong watched him rule. It unsettled her. He did not command the dead so much, but just accompanied them. A soldier came once, still gripping the ghost of a broken spear, eyes wide with the last battlefield he had seen. Jess sat beside him on the steps until the spear dissolved into mist. I failed them, the soldier whispered. Perhaps, Jess said. Yong looked sharply at him, surprised by the honesty. Jess then continued, but you are not only the last thing. You did. And the soldier wept then, not loudly, not heroically, But like a boy who had finally found the room where fear could undress, Young turned away, feeling something in her chest bend. Another time, a mother arrived clutching a lullaby with no child in her arms. She could not cross the silver river. She kept looking behind her. Jess did not tell her to move on. She only asked, "What was the song you're singing?" And the woman with the ruined voice and the river stilled to hear her. Young listened from beneath the archway. Her own light dimmed to amber, and she had thought of all the mothers who had prayed to her for warmth and for the harvest and for fever to break. She had answered with sunlight, but sunlight never sat on the floor beside grief. Sunlight never asked for the song. And that night, Jess found her in the lantern garden. She was touching one of the blue flowers with unbearable care. "You envy them," he said. Young almost laughed. "The dead? The ones allowed to be broken." The flower closed around her fingertip, cool as a moonless water. "I envy anyone who may stop," she admitted. Just stood beside her, not too close, never claiming nearness before she offered it. "I envy the living sometimes," he said. Young looked at him. His gaze remained on the lantern vines. They waste hours. They burn soup. They kiss at the wrong doors and they argue over bread. Then miss each other when one walks away. They think endings are interruptions. His mouth softened. "I know better, so I cannot waste anything. It makes me tired in a different way." Then the confession rested between them, and for once, Young did not know what blessing to give. So she gave none. Yet, she only stood beside him while the flowers opened again, one by one, their blue light trembling across their hands. Slowly, her visits changed. The crown came off sooner. Her robes grew simpler, though simple cloth shone when it touched her. She began to arrive with questions instead of proclamations. She asked why some spirits laughed upon entering, while some slept for years, and while some children in the afterlife chased moths made from memories. Jess answered what he could and admitted what he could not. This too startled her. In her place, ignorance is dressed as prophecy. In his realm, truth could sit barefoot by the fire. Once, she fell asleep mid-conversation. She had been listening to him to speak for the first lantern he had ever lit, back when the world was young and the death frightened even gods. Young meant to ask him whether he had been lonely then. Instead, her head dipped. Her fingers loosened around her cup, and the unfinished question faded in her lips. Jess stopped speaking. The fire breathed softly. Beyond them, souls crossed bridges of black stone under pale lamps, and somewhere the same lullaby returned, carried by a wind that should not have existed underground. "Sleep now, little Ember." When Young woke, a dark cloth had been placed over her shoulders. She sat very still. No one had woken her, and no one had said, "Your radiance, the world waits." No one had turned her rest into failure. Across the room, Jess was writing in a ledger bound with grey thread. He looked up when she stared. "How long?" she asked, pants rising from the habit. "Long enough to dream. I do not dream," Young said. Jess replied that yes, she did. Young touched the cloak. It smelled faintly of smoke, cedar, and winter air. "What did I say?" Jess' expression changed barely, like a candle guarding itself from the wind. "You asked someone not to leave you before morning." And the words entered her quietly and found the oldest wound. Young looked toward the fire. Above the afterlife, somewhere beyond stone and silence, dawn was gathering. Its pierce soon, and the world would need her again. Soon, the palace flowers would burn fresh. Soon, the priest would sing her name until she began and became a symbol instead of a woman. But for one more breath, she remained seated, and for one more breath, Jess said nothing. And in that silence, something unnamed took root between them, delicate as a lantern flower, dangerous as sunrise, waiting for a night that would one day need the moon. Above the afterlife, the world began to notice something was changing with the sun. Not at first. At first, it was an only small thing. Wheat remaining silver with dew a little longer into morning. Children sleeping peacefully past dawn instead of waking from heat-soaked dreams, and lovers lingering beneath the twilight as if dusk itself had forgotten to leave. Priests of the eastern temples whispered that sunsets had become softer. And as lately, it was less like a command and more like a hand slowly unclasping from another hand. The astronomers argued over scrolls until candlelight, drowned beneath morning. They mapped the heavens in frantic strokes of ink and gold leaf, muttering what the Sun Empress now disappeared too quickly beyond the wrathful one. And the old astronomers only laughed tiredly into his wine. Perhaps, he said, staring toward the darkness, sky, and even the sun wishes to go home. Far below those arguments, beneath the rivers of memory and lantern-lit caverns, where dead rested from burden of names, Yong sat beside Jess in a garden where pale moths gathered around blue flowers. She had begun removing her crown before descending an ash stairway now. At the first time she did it openly, the palace attendants nearly cried. "Your Radiance," one minister whispered carefully, "without a crown of day, your aura weakens before the world." Young looked at the polished gold resting in her hands, and the metal reflected her face imperfectly, softened by scratches from centuries of wear. "Weakness," she murmured, "may not be the worst thing." The minister lowered his head immediately, too frightened to answer. But later that night, while descending toward the afterlife with her uncovered hair falling freely down her back like spilled dusk, Young touched the bare face upon her brow again and again, startled by the absence of weight. She realized how long she had mistaken heaviness for purpose. Just noticed the missing crown instantly. Though he said nothing at first, he was seated near the black river, threading through the gardens, sleeves rolled to his elbows as he repaired paper lanterns damaged by wandering spirits. Around him, dim lights floated across the water, like patient stars learning how to drift. Young sat beside him without ceremony. The silence between them had changed recently. It no longer feels cautious, it breathed. After a while, Jess held up a torn lantern toward her. "What do you think?" he said. The lantern had been painted by a child spirit. Crude flowers leaned drunkenly across the paper, their stems too long and their petals uneven. It's crooked," Young said. "It is. The flowers are terrible. Very terrible. But you're smiling," Jess replied. Jess glanced down at the lantern, and for a fleeting moment Yo saw it clearly. The exhaustion beneath his gentleness and the old loneliness hidden beneath his patience. He carried sorrow the way oceans carried salt, quietly and completely. "She made this while waiting for her mother," he said. "I think perfection would ruin it." Young looked at the painted flowers again. It was crooked and fragile, but he loved it anyway. Something inside her chest tightened unexpectedly, and for the first time in a long while, they listened to the river together. Somewhere beyond the gardens, winds wandered softly through the halls of the dead. She often passed through the afterlife unseen, curious as a breeze through open curtains, and sometimes spirit claimed they heard singing when she moved, warm and wistful, carrying scents of rainstorms and distant seas. The night her voice drifted faintly through the corridors. Even stars grow tired of burning, and even oceans wish for shore. Young closed her eyes. She sings like she already knows the ending, Young whispered. Just tied the lantern carefully shut with great thread. Perhaps she knows endings are not always tragedy. And the words lingered. Young turned toward the river to hide how deeply they struck. And above them, the ceiling of the afterlife shimmered faintly with the echoes of mortal skies. Through the stone and shadows, she could feel dawn approaching again. Already prayers climbed toward her and kings begging for victory, sailors begging for calm tides, and farmers begging for warmth before frost reached their fields. The world always arrived hungry. Young exhaled slowly. I used to think love was worship, she admitted quietly, or sacrifice, or endless devotion. Her fingers curled against the dark fabric over her knees. Something earned through usefulness. Jess remained beside her. When I was first crowned, she continued, they told me that a ruler must belong to everyone. That my body is no longer mine, and that my light belonged to the harvest, the kingdoms, and the rivers, and the wars. Her smile came faintly and painfully. I believed them. And now, Yong, the sun goddess, watched one lantern drift farther across the river until it resembled a lonely star crossing water. Now I think, her voice faltered, I think I wanted someone to sit beside me without asking for daylight in return. The garden grew very quiet, and even the moths seemed to slow. Jess set the repaired lantern gently upon the water as it floated away, carrying crooked flowers and gold soft light. You found us eventually, he said. Us and not me. And the word settled over Yong with a strange warmth, because the afterlife was no longer only Jess. Buell had begun appearing more often, bright as a star fallen into laughter. She hung tiny constellations throughout empty corridors because she disliked how solemn the dead became when halls stayed dark for too long, and spirits adored her immediately. Children followed her through the gardens of the underlife, while she pointed upward and invented impossible names for the stars. That one's the lantern fisher, and that one's the fox who ate winter. That one, Buell declared one evening while sprawled upside across a staircase, is definitely Jess refusing to sleep. Jess sighed without looking from his ledger. Constellations should inspire dignity. They should inspire stories, Buell said. Young had laughed before she could stop herself, and the sound startled the room. Everyone paused, even Young. She could not remember the last time laughter escaped without permission. Buell smiled softly, then not teasing and not triumphant, simply warm in the way distant starlight warmed lonely travelers. And there you are, she said gently. The words haunted Young afterward. There you are, not Sun Empress, not Radiance, not divine flame of the eastern sky, but just there you are. Later still came Yejin, carrying the scent of green earth after rain. Wherever she walked, the tiny vines curled instinctively around pillars and benches. She planted silver moss near Black River because she said that the dead deserved soft places too. June then arrived like a streak across midnight, laughing breathlessly, her comet light trailing through the impossible halls while spirits cheered at her impossible speed. Slowly and impossibly, the afterlife began to feel like less than a kingdom and more like a home, and that frightened Young more than loneliness ever had, because homes could be lost. One evening, she lingered too long beside Jess beneath the lantern trees. The fire between them had burned low, but the blue flowers folded themselves and shut for sleep. Somewhere distant, Buell was singing badly on purpose while Jiun protested through the laughter, and the sound echoed through the halls like warmth refusing extinction. Young should have left hours ago. Instead, she sat wrapped in one of Jess's dark looks, watching his hands feed another branch into the fire. I should go, she whispered. Joss nodded once, but neither moved. The silence stretched tenderly, dangerously, and above the earth, dawn sharpened its own golden knives against the horizon. And for the first time since creation, the Sun Empress looked toward the morning with not with duty, but with grief. The grief followed Young upward. It clung to her robes as she ascended the ash stairway from the afterlife back toward the waking heavens. Quiet and cold as river water trapped beneath winter ice. Behind her, the lantern halls dimmed softly into shadow, and ahead, dawn unfurled across the horizon in sheets of gold so bright that they hurt to look at. For the first time in her eternal reign, the sunrise felt cruel. And when she emerged through the final gate of the solar palace, priests already had waited kneeling along the marble path. Servants bowed low enough that their foreheads touched stone, and the bells rang true in the eastern towers in celebration of her return, and golden banners stirred in heated winds. Musicians began their morning hymn before she had even spoken. Young had stopped walking. The hymn faltered, not visibly, not enough for mortal ears. Perhaps Young heard it tremble beneath the melody. It was fear. The entire palace feared the silence around her. One young servant accidentally met her gaze while presenting ceremonial flowers. The girl immediately lowered her eyes, hands shaking so violently that several petals scattered across the floor. "I'm sorry, Your Radiance," and the apology escaped instinctively, as though existing imperfectly before Young required forgiveness. Young looked at the pollen petals. They were moon lilies, pale silver flowers that only bloomed briefly before the dusk, and before sunlight erased them completely. Something inside her chest twisted. "You do not need to apologize," Young said softly. The servant stared at her in confusion, as though kindness from the sun itself felt unnatural. Young walked past, and before the girl could respond, but the moment remained with her through the long procession of morning duties, through council meetings drowned in politics, and through endless prayers rising from kingdoms that needed rain, warmth, harvest, victory, and mercy. The world spoke to her constantly, and begged constantly, and praised constantly. And still, beneath every voice, she heard another sound now, the hush of black rivers and the creak of lanterns swaying gently in underground wind. Jess asking, then stay for the length of one cup. By midday, her temples ached from light, and by evening, she nearly fled the throne room. "You are distracted," observed one elder priest carefully as attendants prepared Young's evening robes. Young said nothing, and the priest hesitated before continuing. "The western provinces report shorter daylight and some fair omens." "Do they?" "Yes, Your Radiance," said the attendant. It was fear and always fear. Young stared at her reflection in the bronze mirror before her. Gold shimmered endlessly across her skin, beautiful and terrible, but divine enough to blind Emperors. Yet now she noticed exhaustion threaded through it all, tiny fractures hidden beneath radiance, and a woman slowly vanishing inside the role the world once adored. She removed an earring absently. "Perhaps," she murmured, "they should fear a world where the sun cannot rest." The attendants froze and no one answered. Even the mirror seemed startled. The night she descended earlier than usual. The moment her feet touched the lower halls of the afterlife, the pressure inside her lungs eased. She had not realized until now how difficult breathing had become above. Buell spotted her first. "Young," she called out brightly from halfway up a staircase, nearly dropping. An armful of star lanterns and tiny silver lights spilled around her feet, like fallen constellations. "You're early." June lost a race against 3 dead sailors, and now she's accusing the river of cheating. From somewhere deeper in the halls came June's offended voice. "The river moved." "The river does not move," Buell shouted back. "It absolutely moved," June replied. Young stared at them, at the laughter, at the complete absence of reverence, and suddenly, impossibly, she smiled before remembering not to. Buell caught it instantly. "There it is again," she said gently. Young looked away, embarrassed by something she did not fully understand. "Where's Jess?" she asked. "Garden near the southern lantern pools." Buell tilted her head curiously. "He's been waiting." and the words landed softly, but Yong carried them all the way through the winding halls. He's been waiting. No priest announced her arrival when she entered the garden, and no choirs, no kneeling crowds bent beneath her light. Only the sound of water and the distant singing met her there. Jess sat beside the lantern poles with Yejin, whose hands were deep in the dark soil as she planted silver-rooted flowers along the riverbank moss, glowed faintly around her sleeves. In nearby Wien rested against a willow tree, while soft winds curled lazily around her ankles, carrying fragments of unfinished melodies through the night air. Jess looked up at first, and there it was again, the unbearable gentleness, but not awe. It was recognition. "You look tired," he said quietly. Yong nearly laughed at the simplicity of it. "Not radiant, not divine, but just tired." "I am," she admitted. Yejin glanced upward sympathetically. "The mortal kingdoms have been noisy lately." "They are always noisy," Wheaton murmured sleepily. "Mortals think panic is a personality," but Yong blinked. Then a startled laugh escaped her before she could suppress it. Wheaton opened one eye triumphantly. "There! I know she could laugh more if the palace stopped acting like she was a sacred wildfire." "I am a sacred wildfire," Yong replied automatically. "Yes," Wheaton said, "but also you're someone who desperately needs soup." The others nodded in immediate agreement. Yong stared at them in disbelief. And for centuries, entire nations had debated her divinity, written hymns for her, and fought wars beneath banners wearing her symbol. And somehow these women looked at her and concluded that Yong needs soup. Something warm cracked open inside her ribs. Later, after Yejin returned to her gardens and Wheaton wandered off humming softly to the spirits drifting near the river, Yong remained beside Jess beneath the willow branches. The lantern light painted silver across the water, and the pools reflected them imperfectly, wavering whenever wind touched the surface. Jess handed her a bowl. Steam curled forward, carrying scents of ginger, onion, sesame oil, and slow-cooked broth. The warmth startled her. "You made this?" "I had help," Jess admitted. "Bill threatened to set the kitchen on fire if I cooked alone again." "Reasonable," Yong said. Jess glanced sideways at her, surprised. Yong lowered her gaze to hide another smile, and they ate quietly for a while. The silence between them no longer trembled with an unnecessary vow. It rested like weary travelers sharing warmth beside the same fire. Above them, the unseen world continued turning toward dawn. Yong dreaded it already. Jess seemed to notice. "You do not have to leave immediately," he said softly. "I do," she said. "You always said that," he replied. Yong said, "Because it is true." Jess looked down to his own untouched bowl and said, "Is it?" The question entered her carefully, but it still hurt. Yong opened her mouth to answer immediately, only to defend duty the way she always had, yet the word stalled, because lately the world had continued spinning even when sunsets lingered longer and children still laughed, rivers still flowed, songs still reached the evening. And here beneath the earth where endings gathered like sleeping birds, Yong had discovered something terrifying. The universe did not collapse when she rested, and the realization should have comforted her. Instead, it made tears suddenly burst behind her eyes. "What if they stopped needing me?" she whispered, and Jess became very still. Then slowly set his bowl aside. Yong said softly, "When the last time someone loved you without first needing something from your light? When was it?" The question hollowed the air, and beyond the willow trees, Ween's voice drifted through the dark once more. "Even stars grow tired of burning, and even oceans wish for shore." Yong lowered her head, and for the first time since becoming the Sun Empress, she wept and wept without trying to hide it. Yong wept quietly beneath the willow branches while the black river carried trembling lantern reflections into the endless dark. No thunder answered her grief, and no divine choir mourned beside her. Only the soft hiss of wind through silver leaves and the warmth of Jess sitting near enough that she did not feel alone first inside her sorrow, and for a long while neither of them spoke. Beyond the garden the afterlight breathed in gentle rhythms, and spirits wandered. Lantern paths and Buell's laughter echoed faintly from distant halls, where she argued passionately with June over whether comets counted as stars. Somewhere deeper in the gardens, Yejin hummed while tending silver-rooted flowers beside the riverbanks. Winds drifted lazily through open corridors, carrying the scent of rain and cedar wood. It sounded like home, and that was precisely the problem. Yong lowered her face into her trembling hands and said, "I didn't want to go back." The confession shattered something fragile between them, not because it was unexpected, but because it was finally spoken aloud. Jess watched the lanterns drift across the water one by one, slow as heartbeats. "You love them," he said softly. "I do," Yong replied. "The mortals, the kingdoms, and the world above." "Yes," her voice cracked, "but I am so tired of belonging to everyone." And a silence followed that felt older than mountains. And her Jess understood so well. He ruled endings, graves, farewells. Last breath whispered into cold air. Souls arrived in his halls carrying the exhaustion of entire lifetimes, and he bore witness to all of it. Eternity was not endless glory. Eternity was repetition, duty, and becoming so necessary that no one remembered you were simply just a person. Slowly Jess understood. The willow branches stirred around him as if the darkness itself recognized its king. Young looked up through tears. She said, "Jess." He extended one hand toward the river. The black waters immediately stilled. Across an entire afterlife, lantern flames flickered blue. Above them, beyond stone and spirit and sleeping worlds, dawn paused upon the horizon. Young felt it instantly. The sun did not rise, and the universe hesitated. In distant kingdoms, roosters quieted mid-call. Priests, waiting for morning light, looked upward in confusion, and oceans reflected the sky that remained suspended between night and day. Children sleeping beneath open windows rolled peacefully deeper into dreams as cool darkness lingered gently around them. The night stretched, not violently but tenderly, as though unseen hands were pulling blankets over a weary world. The wind shifted suddenly through the gardens. Green appeared first beneath the lantern trees, silver ribbons dancing around her sleeves, and her sleepy expression sharpened with surprise as she looked upward through the open ceiling of the afterlife. "The dawn stopped," she whispered. Buell emerged moments later, carrying an armful of unfinished star lanterns. These tiny constellations floated around her hair while Gio nearly crashed into her from behind in a streak of comet light. "Did the sky break?" Jian asked immediately. Yejin arrived last, soil dusting her hands and moss glowing softly along the hem of her robes. All of them turned toward Jess. The Emperor of the Afterlife stood beside a black river with shadows curling around his sleeves like living ink. Yet his gaze remained fixed not upon the heavens, but upon Yong. "I can hold back dawn for a while," he said quietly, "but eventually the world will suffer for it." Yong rose unsteadily beneath the willow branches. "Then let me go back." The words nearly destroyed her to say. Just looked at her then with such unbearable gentleness that the lanterns around them dimmed. "No," he said softly. "I think I am tired watching you suffer too." And the garden fell silent. Even the winds stopped moving. Jess turned his gaze upward toward the dark heavens lingering above creation, and for the first time in countless ages, the sky stood empty at night, with no moon, no silver refuge, and only stars drowning inside endless blackness. It was a lonely sky like Kyung had been. Just lifted one hand slowly toward the heavens, and the afterlife trembled. Rivers of memory rose into the air in silver streams. Lantern flames ascended like fireflies, and the blue flowers along Yejin's garden of planets opened all at once, scattering glowing petals into the wind. Buell's constellation spun upward in spirals of starlight, while Jion's comet trails carved silver fire across the dark, and Wiin's wrapped her winds around them all gently, carrying songs older than mortal kingdoms. And from the center of Jess's outstretched palm, light was born. It was not sunlight. It was softer. It was cooler. It was a resting light. Yong stared upward as fragments of silver rivers and drifting stars gathered above. The world itself and the heavens bent around the growing radiance of clouds and glowed pearl white when beneath it. And the ocean shimmered. Mountains silvered softly beneath the newborn light. Slowly and impossibly, the first moon had begun to form. Young's breath caught painfully in her chest, and Jess whispered. He looked exhausted already, immensely so, as though creating this light demanded pieces of eternity from his very soul. Yet when he looked at her, he smiled. It will not burn them, he said quietly. It will let them rest. Above the world, the moon bloomed fully at last. Silver light spilled across the oceans, across the forest, and across sleeping homes, and across lonely travelers, grieving widows, and children curled beside lanterns. And for the first time in creation, night no longer belonged to darkness alone. Young stepped toward Jess as tears slipped freely down her face once more. But these tears no longer tasted like exhaustion and only love. Behind them, wind began humming softly beneath the newborn moonlight, while Buell laughed through the tears and Jian stared upward in speechless wonder. And somewhere in the mortal world below, a child looked toward the silver sky and asked, "Why does the moon feel gentle?" No priest could answer, and only the quiet heavens knew that moon had been born from longing. Each day, I write and create for my beloved Yongsun, the sun who lights up my every verse, every tale, every quiet thought I dare to share. If her warmth reached you through these words, please like, share, and subscribe. Let's keep stories that shine.